Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a couple of seconds until all the participants are entering the room. So welcome, participants. Welcome, excellencies. Welcome to the panelists. We will get started with our webinar around supporting small firms in developing countries navigate crisis and build resilience. Before we start, I would like to make a couple of house norms. So a few things to keep in mind if we just move to the kind of norms on the next page. One is, please keep yourself muted when other panelists and attendees are speaking. Please do not hesitate to sending us your questions in the chat, or if you have comments that you would like to make, please send them along. We will make then sure that we pick up your questions in the Q&A session, as well as in the discussion that we will have at the end of the webinar. The third is, if you have any issues, technical issues, please do not hesitate to reach out to Corina or some of our ILO colleagues who are stated here to get some support and help. Last but not least, I would like to inform that the webinar is being recorded. So now that we have covered the fun parts of the webinar, we will really get started with our content. We would like to get started by telling you why we have done this report and why we have done this framework and created this framework between the ILO and McKinsey. Secondly, I just want to introduce you to whom is going to be with us today, and then what we will do. So why we have done this is that we realized that the small firms are really fundamental in driving decent job, but also economic growth. However, these small firms are often very vulnerable, especially in times of shocks. And shocks can be a pandemic, but shocks can also be an economic crisis, war, a hurricane, or digital change that is happening out there. And our framework is not only looking at short-term initiatives to help them survive, but we also really want to focus on how to build long-term resilience and capabilities to respond to future shocks. Because there are going to be many more, and probably they will become more frequent with smaller intervals. The solution is not easy, and there is no one size fits all. And many stakeholders will need to get involved and interplay to make this a success. So today we really want to kind of ignite you to action. We want to have a conversation, and we also want to look at what it means for the African region specifically. So now who's with us today? If we can go to the page with the different panelists. We will have Dragan Radic, who will be co-moderating with me. Dragan is the head of the ILO SME unit, and he will say a couple of words later on. We then have two very important people who will present you the framework. Séverine Debus from the ILO, as well as Corina Stonesco, a project manager from McKinsey. And once we'll have introduced the framework, we'll move into the panel discussion, where we have four wonderful panelists. We have Rodrigue Raul from the enterprise section in the ILO. We have Gary, and then we have two McKinsey people Acha Leke, a senior partner and also chair of McKinsey Africa, as well as Janate, who's based in Casablanca. So with that, the agenda in very short, Séverine and Corina will give you a very short introduction into the framework. We're trying to not make this about theory and concept because you can also read the report. We will then listen to our panelists share a couple of reflections of how they see it in the African region. And then we will move to a Q&A if you have any questions, or immediately into group discussion to also hear from some of you on the webinar what they feel, you know, some of their learnings around solutions out there and what could be done. With that, I would hand over to Dragan to say a couple of welcoming words before we then move to Corina on the framework.
Great. Thank you, Nina. Your Excellencies, representatives of governments, workers and employers, the ILO and McKinsey colleagues, distinguished participants, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us at this exciting webinar, really. So let me first start with one figure, and this is 70%. Self-employed, micro and small firms alone account for over 70% of jobs globally. So SMEs are crucial to the future of work, not just for employment creation and economic growth, but also to drive innovation and the transition to green economies. As we work to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the ILO's Decent Work Agenda, we cannot simply afford to ignore the potential of SMEs and the challenges that they face. Let me now zoom quickly on Africa. In the current global context to which Africa is exposed, small firms are experiencing multiple shocks, including excessive inflation, raw material shortages, financial and currency instability, food and energy price shocks, difficulties in accessing markets, climate change, and many social and political risks. It is clear that the pandemic and the conflicts we see today around the world could leave a lasting impact on your continent over several years. Meanwhile, around 30 million people in Africa were pushed into extreme poverty in 2021. And around 22 million jobs were lost in the same year because of the pandemic. And the trend is expected to continue throughout the second half of 2022, maybe even in 2023. And then on top of that, even before this crisis, Sub-Saharan Africa needed to create between 600 and 800 million jobs. These are additional jobs by 2050 to keep pace with the growing population. So by supporting SMEs to overcome the many shocks they face, the ILO is improving the livelihoods of the people who run them, those who work for them, and everyone who relies on their products and services. Now, recognizing the threat of a wide variety of shocks, the ILO and McKinsey partnered to develop a framework of possible policy interventions to prepare and to support small firms during such shock conditions, right? And you know, dealing with this topic connects from ILO perspective very well with the other areas of work where we intervene to promote SMEs, like entrepreneurship development, productivity, enterprise formalization, women-led businesses, enabling business environment, among others. So let me conclude here, Nina. This framework provides African countries with a large set of possible policy options to help small firms confront crises and build resilience against them. What is important to say here, though, is it's not aimed to advocate for one particular type of measures or provide a one-size-fits-all solution. We hope that you will consider this framework to confront the increasingly important risks and repercussions on small firms and jobs in the African regions. We look really forward to this discussion and how you see this framework being useful to you. Thank you, Nina. Thank you.
Thank you, Dragan. So with that, you build a lot of expectations for, Corina and Severin, who will now present the framework. Corina, over to you.
Thank you, Nina. Maybe we can already go to the next slide, Soari. So as Nina and Dragan were sharing, practically it all starts from this publication that we put together with the colleagues at ILO. And what is it ultimately? What we try to create is, as much as possible, a comprehensive list of what can be done by governments, but also in collaboration with ecosystem partners, on the one hand during crisis, to support the survival ultimately of their small firm constituencies, but also outside crisis situations to help them build resilience ahead of future shocks. Of course, it was written during COVID, and a lot of the inspiration we got was from COVID, but we tried to look, as Nina was saying, far beyond, at what governments do in case of natural disasters, pandemics, economic downturns, even wars, political storms. So we try to be quite broad. And another thing we try to do is make it as actionable and I would say concrete as possible, and that in two ways. On the one hand, if you access the framework, and you can find it at the QR code, you would find more than 100 concrete examples of what governments have done for specific sectors. And also there is an entire chapter that we tried to dedicate to the how of the equation. So not only to choosing what you do as in support, but also how you can think of deployment in a way that increases the likelihood of these measures actually reaching the impact that you're aiming for. So with that being said, if you want, sorry, to go to the next slide, the first question that comes to mind, and I think Dragan has also touched upon it, is why this makes sense for Africa, and why are we here today to discuss the framework in the context of Africa. And I think the short answer is that African small firms are very likely to be exposed to shocks. The first reason, or the top of mind, is weather, climate change exposures, and a high likelihood of drought, particularly in some regions. But then also, it's a reality that the vast majority of small firms in Africa are informal, which makes it both difficult for them to be supported, but also creates limitations in terms of their availability of resources, but also their access to resources. For instance, less than 1/3 of SMEs in sub-Saharan Africa have a bank loan or a line of credit. Then also, if we think, another challenge has to do with the concentration in specific activity sectors, such as, for instance, agriculture, that both limit the optionality of the economy adapting, but also tend to be the type of sectors that inherit global crisis. So, for instance, in the context of COVID, more than half of the SMEs in Africa struggled to access inputs to continue their operations. And as a consequence, more than 3/4 had to reduce sales. Now, enough about what creates vulnerability. What we also try to do in the framework, and sorry if you can maybe go to the next slide, we try to look also statistically at what governments have done to support. And what you see on the screen is an analysis on the frequency of different support measures during COVID-19. And one trend that we observed globally, including in Africa, is that the overwhelming majority of support, when available, was really focused on improving the financial stability and liquidity of small firms, then followed by employment continuity. But still, an interesting observation that was quite, I think, was quite unique to the case of COVID-19 was also that some countries started experimenting either with directly supporting the operations of their constituencies. So, for instance, South Africa and some other countries were closing hotel barters with the hotel industry to use their idle capacity for quarantining, but also starting to experiment with restructuring procedures in a way that prolongs, or let's say limits, the financial burden on SMEs. And an example here would be Malawi, who created a framework around issuing moratoriums on debt services and allowing SMEs to restructure their loans in a way that, again, they don't become overburdened by their debt servicing obligations. Now, if you can go to the And maybe the last type of interesting support measures that we've noticed have to do with resilience building. I mean, we can slice and dice it in many ways, but maybe an important pillar here is has to do with capability building and with increasing managers' ability to understand, assess, react to risks. An example here is even an ILO program, the SURE training program, that really helps managers of small firms develop crisis management capabilities. Another interesting type of support has to do with increasing the very, very low access of SMEs in Africa to insurance products. And we know that part of the reason why SMEs are often underinsured or uninsured also has to do with the fact that the costs or the premium they would have to pay would be prohibitive, given the difficulty to correctly assess their level of risk. So, for instance, what this UK Business Continuity Institute is doing, which is, I mean, it's based in the UK, but operates, I think, in almost 40 different countries, is trying to issue resilience certificates that would then allow the SMEs to access insurance at lower premiums. And maybe the last but not least, we've also noticed an emergence of very simple software tools, like, for instance, the one launched by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, that would help managers assess the type of impacts that crises are likely to have on their operations. Again, these are just a few examples of the 100 plus you would identify in the framework. But as I was saying, we try to put a lot of emphasis also into the how, and that's why I'll pass the ball to Severin, our colleague from the ILO, who will explain in a bit more detail how we tackled this piece.
Thank you so much, Corinna. And indeed, let's now have a few minutes to think about the how to ensure indeed that we don't apply a one-size-fits-all solution, like Dragan was mentioning in his introduction. So here, of course, these are few tips on and key considerations on how to take on board the lessons learned that have been presented by Corinna, and what are some of the key elements to be taken into account in the implementation of such measures and such support to crisis. So the key principle indeed is there's not one size fits all solution. And in the implementation of measures, government can do few things to help them thinking through on how they can ensure that the measures are indeed fit for purpose. The first set of questions to be asked is on what kind of crises and what are the focus segments on which governments and other stakeholders should focus their attention. So the kind of crises, what are the economic segments that should be considered? We saw before the tourism sectors, etc., in certain conditions, etc. So these are the first set of questions that can be considered in terms of crafting the right response. The second set of questions is on choosing the best fit levers and tailoring the measures. So here a key word is impact. So would it be more through direct support? Would it be more through channeling some of the existing and using some of the existing program and structures to disburse fund or to provide support? So how can the measures reach their impact, and what kind of support can the government and partners afford? So we know about the fiscal space. We discussed a lot during the COVID-19 crisis about the fiscal capability of governments, but beyond also the fiscal capabilities, it's also about capacity and capabilities of the structure and the individual to actually provide the support. So these are the second set of questions that can help in tailoring the measures. And the third set of questions is about how to deploy, monitoring, and adapt the measures. So how can I, as policymaker, make sure that the measures reach the desired impact? And also a key question here is how maybe can I use this measure to move towards more long-term objective. And this is where also the whole discussion about the nexus between humanitarian and development comes in and can be brought into the thinking and into the design of the measures. Can we please go to the next slide? And so regarding, regardless of the measures, there are further three considerations to be taken into account that are key for success. The first consideration is about coordination, and obviously this is a recurrent subject that we have in terms of interministerial coordination, but also dialogue and how the various stakeholders can work together in terms of planning the support. And that's not just inside the country or inside a specific region. If we talk about more internal crises and more specific crises, but it's also looking beyond, again, the specific location where the crisis took place. And for that, it's very key to activate the broader ecosystem and to engage in social dialogue, obviously with employers organization, with workers organization, and with all actors that can play a role in the ecosystem to ensure that that we reach impact. The last consideration that needs to be taken into account is also to tailor measure, for example, women, young entrepreneurs, and key factors for that, or key thought in tailoring measures can be, for example, where can we have more impact? Where can we have multiplier effects in terms of support measures, and where can we also lead to more long-term achievement in targeting some specific groups. So, for example, here, of course, we need to bring in the dimension of informal enterprises that very often need a tailored approach. And again, the COVID-19 crisis showed how vulnerable people in the informal economy are, and how it is important to coordinate the support to informal enterprises with individual and household support mechanism. So in these cases, we saw how important these measures can be to create a transition towards formalization and to help the enterprises and the people in the informal economy to actually go towards improvement in their decent working condition and broader into their situation. So this is, as a very high level, again, presentation of the framework. And with that, I will give back to Nina to take us to how in Africa we can take that on board and have a discussion on such measures. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Séverine, and thank you, Corina, for the great presentation. Apologies for a bit of technical issues on the screen and on the presentation, but we will now anyways move to the panelists and to a bit of a discussion and hearing some reflections. And with that, I would love to have us kick off with Rodrigue. And I would love to hear from you, Rodrigue. What are the type of measures that you have noticed that you found were particularly impactful? And what are some of these innovative best practices that you have seen? And in a second kind of phase, can you tell us a little bit more about what you think more is needed? Yeah, what more could be done, either by governments, but also by other ecosystem partners, and how each of us on this call can contribute. So Rodrigue, over to you.
Bien, merci. J'espère que vous me suivez très bien.
Très bien.
Bien, OK. Je remercie déjà les collègues de Genève, en particulier Dragan, qui nous a associés à cette activité. Et je salue tous les participants ici présents, ainsi que le partenaire McKinsey. Je voudrais déjà dire que le ciblage du cadre sur les micro, petites et moyennes entreprises en Afrique est indiqué parce que ce sont elles qui constituent l'essentiel de la démographie des entreprises, et elles sont les plus créatrices d'emplois. Et comparativement aux grandes entreprises, elles ont été les plus impactées parce qu'elles ont des contraintes intrinsèques que la pandémie n'a fait qu'exacerber. C'est vrai qu'ici, nous parlons de petites entreprises. Peut-être qu'on peut déjà se poser la question définitionnelle. Bon, donc je suppose ici que nous voyons en gros tous ceux qui sont les micro, petites et moyennes entreprises dont on catégorise en fonction de l'effectif des employés et du chiffre d'affaires. Je voudrais aussi noter que les effets de la COVID-19, tels qu'on a mentionné dans le cadre, sont ceux aussi qui ont été déclarés par les dirigeants d'entreprises dans les diverses enquêtes que l'OIT a menées dans divers pays que nous couvrons. Et je confirme aussi qu'en plus du tourisme, tel que Séverine l'a dit tout à l'heure, il y a aussi d'autres secteurs qui ont été très touchés du fait des mesures de prévention, comme par exemple le transport, l'hôtellerie-restauration et le commerce d'une manière générale. Et ce qui est bien à noter, c'est qu'avec ou sans le soutien des gouvernements, les entreprises, en fait, ont pris eux-mêmes des mesures d'adaptation pour continuer leur activité et maintenir autant que possible les emplois. Donc, mon premier commentaire de fond, c'est de dire que les États, effectivement, ont pris diverses mesures politiques, de politique publique pour soulager les entreprises. Mais quand on regarde, en général, c'était des mesures d'ordre fiscal pour assurer la liquidité et la stabilité financière des entreprises. Bon, on voit donc qu'il n'y a pas eu souvent de transfert direct de cash aux entreprises et de subventions de salaire ou de compléments de salaire, par exemple. Et ça se comprend. C'est vrai que les entreprises, dans les enquêtes, auraient naturellement souhaité avoir aussi des mesures de soutien financier direct. Et nous pensons qu'à notre connaissance, ça n'a pas toujours été le cas parce que les entreprises ont les États, je veux dire, ont beaucoup de contraintes budgétaires. Donc, les États n'ont pas de grande capacité financière pour injecter les liquidités dans les économies et continuent à laisser plonger leur déficit budgétaire et les taux d'endettement importants. Et dans nos zones, certains des États sont en fait sous programme d'ajustement budgétaire avec le Fonds monétaire international, ce qui réduit en fait leur marge de manœuvre. Pour l'appropriation du cadre par les États, j'ai quelques suggestions qui me sont venues à l'esprit. C'est déjà que il faut tenir compte de la situation particulière de nos États où c'est le secteur informel qui prime. Comme on l'a dit tout à l'heure, pratiquement 85% des emplois au sud du Sahara sont dans le secteur informel. Et on a vu que la plupart des mesures qui ont été prises, en fait, s'adressaient plus pour les entreprises formelles. Et donc, nous disons qu'il y a davantage d'efforts à fournir, densifier les mesures pour le secteur informel, mais pas pour que les acteurs du secteur informel restent informels, mais à la fois des mesures pour favoriser les transitions vers la formalité, mais renforcer en même temps leur résilience. D'autant plus que la formalisation des entreprises est une des priorités dans la déclaration d'Abidjan de 2019 sur l'avenir du travail décent en Afrique. Et mais nous sommes conscients que pour le secteur informel, un défi de taille, c'est le ciblage. Parce que par définition, ces entreprises ne sont pas immatriculées. Et je dois ajouter un dernier point sur ce point, que les interventions dans ce secteur doivent être adaptées aux diverses caractéristiques, aux circonstances et aux besoins des unités économiques du secteur informel. Et donc, il est important ici, du fait qu'on n'arrive pas toujours à les identifier, d'apprendre à travailler avec les organisations fêtières. La deuxième suggestion, c'est par rapport à la temporalité de la mise en œuvre du cadre. Donc, nous pensons que les États, effectivement, doivent développer des politiques et des stratégies globales de soutien aux entreprises pendant les crises et de ne plus agir de manière ad hoc, car les prochaines crises sont forcément certaines. Et il faut aussi souligner que les mesures qui doivent être prises ne doivent pas seulement favoriser, protéger les entreprises, mais également les emplois dans les entreprises qui sont impactées. Et donc, pour nous, à moyen terme, les États de l'Afrique subsaharienne gagneraient à mettre en place un environnement institutionnel, législatif et réglementaire qui soit favorable aux entreprises dans les situations de crise. On peut peut-être dans les commentaires revenir sur ça. On doit aussi accélérer la diversification économique avec plus de transformation locale de des matières premières pour amoindrir les chocs sur la demande extérieure des matières premières. Et naturellement, on doit accélérer la transition vers la formalité parce qu'il y a des évidences que le secteur informel a été plus impacté que le secteur formel. Et j'ajoute aussi une autre idée, c'est d'engager des réflexions prospectives sur des mesures économiques pérennes qui vont amener nos États à savoir amoindrir les conséquences sur les petites entreprises lorsqu'il y a des situations de crise. Par exemple, on peut avoir des chaînes de valeur reconnues stratégiques qu'on peut faire en sorte que ce soit réalisé dans des continuums géographiques parce qu'on a par exemple vu que lorsqu'on avait des chocs sur les circuits internationaux d'approvisionnement, les entreprises n'arrivaient plus à s'approvisionner. Et donc, ici, c'est tout l'intérêt de la zone de libre-échange économique, ce qu'on appelle la ZLECAf en Afrique, qui est mise ici en lumière. Et je suggère aussi que les États puissent élaborer et mettre en œuvre des plans nationaux qui vont viser à renforcer les capacités des entreprises dans la gestion des crises et la continuité opérationnelle de leurs affaires, et améliorer aussi la connaissance des entreprises sur la législation du travail en cas de crise. La dernière suggestion par rapport au cadre, et vous êtes aussi revenu sur ça, c'est d'insister sur l'importance du dialogue social, à la fois bipartite entre les entreprises et entre les employeurs et les travailleurs, mais aussi tripartite en ajoutant l'État. Bon, le dialogue bipartite a un grand avantage, c'est que ça peut aider les travailleurs et les employeurs à avoir des positions communes lorsqu'il s'agit donc de gérer les crises et d'aller négocier avec le gouvernement. Et le dialogue social tripartite évite que, en plus des crises dues, comme on a vu, à la pandémie, dues aux crises, aux guerres à l'international ou même aux crises climatiques, que s'ajoutent les crises sociopolitiques lorsque ce dialogue social tripartite n'est pas bien mené. Donc voilà les quelques éléments qui ont attiré notre attention lorsqu'on a lu le cadre, qui nous semble un cadre qui peut tout à fait s'adapter dans nos contextes, moyennant, je veux dire, qui peut tout à fait être pris en compte dans nos contextes, moyennant effectivement des adaptations. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Rodrigue, pour votre intervention. Very interesting to hear, especially the comments around the key focus on financial kind of survival and fiscal measures, and the need to also think about the entire informal labor market and what would be appropriate measures there. With that, perhaps I would go over to Janate. Perhaps you can share a couple of your reflections, especially focusing on good things also that you have seen and what has worked and what was impactful. We hear a lot about what more can be done, but perhaps you also have a couple of ideas on what are things that are there that we can build on. And of course, if you have anything on what more, we would be really interested in hearing. So Janate, over to you.
Thank you, Nina, and thanks to the organizing team for the invitation. Yeah, maybe a few thoughts indeed. I wanted to share a bit what I have observed as successful initiatives in African countries to apply this framework and answer to some of the pain points of SMEs. But first, I really wanted to insist on why this framework is important for African economies and what are the things that are very specific about African SMEs that needs to be taken into account in the initiatives that are implemented. The colleagues shared some figures earlier, and I wanted to insist on the fact that SMEs are playing a key role in Africa. They account for more than 80% of the workforce in both formal and informal, and they play an outsized role in the economies, regional economies versus other countries. So SME is indeed a very important topic for Africa, and making sure that they are viable is really essential to the continent's economy. The second key message that I wanted to share is about the specificities of African SMEs and what make them particularly vulnerable. So there are a lot of common topics for SMEs globally. So we heard about access to markets, funding, and so on. But I think there are a few things that I wanted to highlight as specific to Africa that would make sense to address specifically with an adapted answer. The first one is that the lack of resilience is particularly high, and I wanted to share a few facts on that. So the SMEs in Africa struggle more than others to go through crisis. For example, they tend to struggle with very essential and fixed costs to operate their organizations, right? For example, rental, paying employees, not even focusing on investing or growing, but really on day-to-day operational considerations. And we had conducted discussions with some West African countries during the COVID time, and actually most of the SMEs could not survive more than 2 months without any support. And just to give an order of magnitude, most of them, half of them, needed a support of less than 2,000 USD. So we're talking about very, very vulnerable SMEs that don't have enough treasury to be resilient, and for which the needs in terms of funding and so on are somehow limited to survive. So this is the scale and the type of SMEs that exist in Africa as well. The second thing that is very specific about African SMEs is that there is a larger portion than in other regions that is owned by women, but also a large portion in the agriculture sector. So this requires specific answers to be developed for these target segments, women and agricultural SMEs, which will have very specific needs, and that is specific to the African landscape. I think a third point that we've seen, again, through the discussions with our clients in Africa, but also through the surveys that we have conducted, is that there is a major, and I think this point is more important than in other regions as well, is there is a major lack of awareness and capabilities. And this especially was very important during the crisis, during the COVID period, where a lot of the SMEs that we discussed with invoked a lack of information or a lack of ability to go through the process to have access to the government packages. So as we know, a lot of governments had put together like support packages for SMEs, for vulnerable population, including in Africa, of course. But a lot of these small organizations were not able to benefit from these measures because of a lack of information or capacity to have access to this measure, go through the process to mobilize the funding that was made accessible. So I think this is an attention point that is probably most important in Africa than in other regions. And I think the last point that for me is very specific to African SMEs is around new type of SMEs in the digital space or the startups, where the specific regulations, legal status and approaches to be supported are not very clear or yet very well established in the continent. And this is definitely a new type of SMEs that need to be supported and that help the young talents to also have access to some opportunities. So I thought it was important to share a few of the specificities of the African SMEs that will require tailored answers in these big buckets that we've seen in the framework, because the reality in Africa is slightly different than in other regions and in all these aspects. So maybe the last point, I wanted to share a few examples of what some countries have done in order to address the specificities, in order to make it a bit more concrete. Maybe one example that I like is the enhancement of digital inclusions for SMEs in order to enable them to be better integrated, but also to create this startup ecosystem that I was talking about. In North Africa and especially Morocco, we've seen a few initiatives launched by the Agency of Digital. So they, for example, implemented a digital academy, which is an online platform that is aiming at upskilling SME employees on digital to enable better inclusion in this space. They also launched other initiatives related to startups in order to develop the startup ecosystem through, for example, a platform that is consolidating an area of the startups, consolidating the opportunities in order to connect the startups with potential business opportunities. So this type of initiatives around the digital space are very interesting to investigate for the continent. The other big idea that I liked is to some countries that leverage the corporate sector in order to support SMEs. So we think that it's a prerogative of the government, and it is. A lot of the initiatives come from public entities, from the government itself. There is a lot of expectations from banks as well and financial institutions for the access to funds, but there is also a responsibility from corporates, right? And especially in order to give better access to markets, to the SMEs, and enable them to be referenced as suppliers and so on. So the idea here is to try to adapt the conditions in order to work with the big corporations for local SMEs with more flexible rules, and in order to also be supportive of the local SME ecosystem. Maybe one last example on capability building. So I mentioned that the talent topic, the awareness, access to information is very critical. And we've seen a few successful initiatives launched in North Africa, but also elsewhere in the world, in Asia or in Europe, which are the smart factories. And this is a concept that helps SMEs get trained very concretely in a factory environment on new technologies, new management practices in order to upskill SMEs employees and enable to not only improve their efficiency and productivity, but also to make them more viable on the long term. So I wanted to share these few specific examples that have been successful in African countries and that tackle specifically some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Janette. Great examples and very specific and concrete. I would like to give the word to Gary to hear, your reflection, Gary, in general, but also perhaps you or someone else in the panel wants to come back to one of the questions that one of the participants has asked, as we spoke quite a bit about the informal labor market, stating that somehow the tax pressure in a lot of the African countries and then unemployment level is somehow giving incentives to SMEs to remain informal, and having a question mark around what is the right way to engage to potentially support and help without being seen like a formalization agent by some of these SMEs. And so not that you, Gary, have to answer this question, but question that is out there and you might have a couple of reflections. So over to you, Gary.
Sure, thanks, Nina, and good afternoon, everybody. I think, look, one of the biggest difficulties for SMEs when you're looking at resilience and developing contingency and continuity planning is they lack two critical things, time and money. And you're asking them to invest in a further expense, both in their time and their money, in developing a contingency and continuity plan for something that I think is perceived, may or may not happen. And I think, as we've seen over the last number of years, crises happen all the time. They're either a global crisis that will shut the entire economy down. It's a localized crisis in terms of an electricity outage or a security issue or a regional issue or a climate issue, but they happen all the time. So I think there's a body of work that needs to be done to, I suppose, get that message across that, crisis will happen. And if you have a plan, you can maybe stave off the worst of it. And that's been the approach that we've been developing in the ILO over the last year and a half through our kind of short training program, which is designed to help SMEs come up with a resilience plan. Now, in the course of that development of that particular training module, we had a steering committee with experts in this area from multinationals and from elsewhere, academia, but particularly the multinationals imparted on us the importance of contingency planning, and the plans that they had were extremely complex, in cases very expensive, and beyond, I would say certainly anybody but a large company. And I think that maybe scares some of the smaller SMEs off, in that it looks like a very big enterprise to go down in terms of putting this together. It's going to cost a lot of money and a lot of time. But also in the course of developing the material, we had a number of case studies which would show that, yes, it can be extremely complex and expensive, but it can also be really simple. And we had one example of a farmer, and she made honey-based products from beeswax. And her main kind of means of production was 24 beehives. Now she had these in a particular location which was exposed to weather systems, a particular part of the farm. And so the first recommendation was, well, split them, move half of the beehives to a different part of the farm that's maybe on higher ground and less exposed. So she's half to risk in terms of her means of production. The second thing then was the product is non-perishable. So therefore she could move, say, half of it or quarter of it to her brother's place in town. Again, half and a quarter the risk to her stock. So two things in the course of a 20-minute conversation that literally half the risk of a very, very small enterprise. So I think that's one of the kind of issues that we kind of would push down this kind of training, is that it can be a complicated thing, it can be a simple thing, but you do need a plan because something will happen. And it's either going to be a very large global crisis, or it'll be something maybe more localized. The other thing I think we're trying to kind of push with this product, and we're doing it here in South Africa in the tourism sector, is the importance of trying to label the entire sector as resilient. And sectors have done this. I mean, if you look at, you've ever been on an airplane, if you sit down in an airplane, the first thing you're greeted with is extremely alarming language. An oxygen mask may fall down, brace yourself for impact. Put a life jacket on. We might be in the ocean. You'll have a whistle, which I never thought the value of the whistle, but it's very alarming language. Or go to a ski resort or something like that. Again, risks of avalanche or any other high risk activity, and you get all of these warnings. And people generally just are fairly blasé about it because they've normalized a high risk environment because we've been given these assurances that there's these different mechanisms in place if something does go wrong. So putting that into practice at a sectoral level, I think, can add a real competitive advantage. It's something we're trying to do with the tourism sector here in South Africa. If something does go wrong, there is a plan in place. You can do that also, at a city, even a country level. One example, not from the region, but from the Philippines. From a previous life, I did some work in Legazpi in the Philippines, and this is probably one of the most dangerous cities in the world. It sits on an active earthquake. Fault plates are there. There's an active volcano. It's exposed to the worst weather systems, all those coming up from the Pacific. And yet it's had remarkably few deaths, I think none in the last 40 years. And it absorbs these crises, these weather patterns and crises that come in with regularity, with aplomb, because they've got a system and a culture of preparedness. And they've actually used this to attract investment into the location, because they've told investors and companies, we have a plan. If this stuff happens, look at the track record, we're prepared for it. And they've even used it in terms of, some of the, social kind of policies. For example, cigarette smoking, apart from being an awful habit, and the butts block drains and filters. So smoking is largely prohibited in large parts of the city. Garbage refuse, again, can be a hazard. It's very effectively done. So the place is lovely. It's clean. It's attracting tourists and it's attracting investors. And they're using that resilience brand to do that. So I think they're examples of that kind of competitive edge you can use. Yeah, at the firm level, what we've been trying to do with the short training is, to put smaller companies together. You're in the same boat. What costs could be shared? What risks could be shared? Here in South Africa, there's issues with public utilities, access to electricity, water. Can those things be shared? Things like stock, and you can raise those kind of risk sharing and cost sharing mechanisms all the way up to kind of fairly elaborate, mechanisms like sharing of staff, even sharing of financial resources in the case of a major catastrophe. So I think there's lots of kind of things that can be done in that respect. So maybe the last thing in terms of what we can do with just keeping an eye on the time, maybe the last thing we can do in terms of the branding of this, certainly in the ILO, we're using this mantra, and of course the entire UN system, this Build Back Better. It actually predates COVID-19. It was the Secretary General had pushed this from 2016, 2017, when he first came in, this culture of prevention. So we spend all of this money trying to fix things, whereas in much better use of resources and all of the rest of it in terms of trying to create this kind of culture of prevention. So I think that's something that we can kind of at the international level very much so kind of push. And as I said, you know, there could be resilience right down to very small firms can be something that really is quite simple. And of course, it can be something very, very complicated. I'll leave it there, Nina. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gary. Perhaps last but not least, I would like to ask Acha to share a couple of reflections. And probably, Acha, you have worked in every single country on the continent, in every industry that exists, from tourism to telecom to, you know, banking. Would you like to share a little bit what you have seen and perhaps some of the threads, but also differences that you have seen in different SMEs?
Yeah, no, happy to, Nina, and thanks for the invitation. I think we've spoken a lot, so I'll try to keep it short, so we have enough time for Q&A. I mean, I think, you know, a lot of the panelists have made the main points. What's relevant, I think Jeanette started there, is if you look at Africa, you know, again, it's, as we know, 90 million MSMEs. They represent 83% of the private sector employment, so it's huge on the continent, right? But as somebody said, I think my colleague from Cameroon was saying, you know, only 15% are registered. So you know, 85% are not registered, and most of them are micro. And there are a number of issues. So through COVID, we actually worked with the AUD, NEPAD, and EcoBank to come up with a program to support MSMEs through COVID and post-COVID. I just want to touch on some elements of that program, because I think that's exactly what MSMEs needed. We did a big survey of the MSMEs to understand what were the challenges they were facing, and that helped us then design this program. The program had 4 components. One is, and we haven't spoken much about it, it's an MSME academy. There's a lot of training that is needed. You know, how do you prepare a business plan? How do you raise financing? You know, how do you close your books at the end of the month? So there's a big MSME academy. We got a number of partners, Microsoft, for example, a number of other strategy, and we launched this. And we're able to touch about 3 million MSMEs across 13 countries through that program, right? So it's actually quite successful and it's ongoing, but there's a lot of training that's needed to help MSMEs improve the skills and the capabilities. The second is financing. We've talked about it quite a bit here, right? We looked at what's happening even during COVID. You know, governments put in place stimulus packages, but the reality is those stimulus packages were primarily for registered companies. And as we said, most of the MSMEs were not registered. And even when, you know, there were some packages that were in place for some of the MSMEs, we actually sized the gap between what MSMEs needed versus what governments had in place. And there was a $40 billion gap, right? So just not enough that our governments could put in place to support MSMEs. And so financing is a big component of it. And we have that part has not been launched yet. But it's really trying to figure out how can we get more financing, how can we get some guarantees in place to support SMEs through some of the financing needs. The third, then, after you know, the financing and the training program, is a marketplace, right? It's really some MSMEs are saying, look, I have some products, but how do I, you know, get them out there? You know, how do I ensure that I can reach customers? So there's a real marketplace strategy, you know, to connect MSMEs with opportunities. And I know there's been a lot, we talked about it in the past, a lot of push to say, do we get, you know, government procurement to dedicate a certain percentage, whether it's 30%, just really for MSMEs? And even if that's the case, how does an SME know when, you know, the Ministry of Tourism in Uganda is issuing out a tender, right? So how do you create those linkages? So that's quite important. And then finally, this is all underpinned by a digital platform, which, you know, we're working with AUD and EPAD. We're trying to see if we can get support from other players of the MasterCard Foundation to build. So you have the MSMEs that actually can come on digital platform, they can then register, and through they can access all these opportunities. So there are a number of programs in place that's critical for the SMEs. And the final thing I'll touch on is, I think there was a point about, you know, many of them, again, we said they're not registered, they're in the informal sector. What, you know, and there's a reason for that, because they know that once they register, you know, they're going to start to be taxed. And the question, on the other hand, what benefits are they getting from being registered? For me, it's just, you know, it's a cost-benefit trade-off. And one thing we, you know, during COVID, we had many conversations with governments to say, look, at the end of the day, there will be many more crises. We know that there will be crises. And if governments can really show SMEs that they're there for them during this crisis, and they can really provide support, and some of these stimulus packages are really well designed for the MSMEs, you'll probably see more registering, and they'll register because they know that when there's a crisis, when they're faced with difficulties, and they don't have as much of a cushion as some of the large companies that they can rely on. And so when they're faced with difficulties, the government will come through for them. And so we thought that was actually a good opportunity for governments to think through what can we do to really show SMEs that we're there to protect them. And as a result of that, really encourage them to register, and you get more of them coming to the formal sector. So let me just keep it there, and then we can engage in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Acha. Thanks a lot, and very interesting points. And with that, I would perhaps like to put on the spot, or not fully on the spot, because he wrote into the chat, Jose Manuel Medina, who had some questions and reflections around also the digital academy that Janate, you mentioned in Morocco, but also thinking of how can we ensure that these services are really inclusive and also benefit the more rural communities or marginalized group. And so, Jose, perhaps I give over to you, and you can mention a couple of your reflections, and then perhaps some of the panelists have additional thoughts.
Thank you, Nina, very much so. My name is Jose Manuel Medina. I'm a colleague at the ILO as well, covering actually North Africa. So I've been in touch with the Moroccan experience, Genate, and I really like the initiative that the government of Morocco took of developing this digital academy, but also that many other countries has put in place, for instance, to support startups as in general technology-driven businesses, right? And we see that this is very much in trending. I'm based in Cairo, so Egypt is one of those countries where the entrepreneurship ecosystem is vibrant and dynamic. But we always see that this entrepreneurship ecosystem, or the entrepreneurship development that is being developed many times, do not reach everyone at the same level. Now, so my question would be, did you, when you were doing this framework or analyzing a bit the different African experience, did you come across any good practice where countries, employers association, private sectors, actors of the ecosystem has put in practice measures that are a bit more inclusive, in particular to help MSMEs in rural communities, self-employed people, those who might not have, I mean, and I've been hearing our colleagues talking about informal enterprises as well, but other than informal enterprises, I'm taking into account that they will be for sure informal, but they are also placed in rural areas where access to information, access to technology can be also very challenging. I don't know if you have identified any of those best practices, or if you have any reflection on that topic. Over.
Thank you, Jose. Anyone on the panel who wants to share a bit more? Janate, I think you had some thoughts, so perhaps I hand over to you.
Yes, maybe just a few thoughts on this question. Thank you, Jose, for the question. I think inclusivity is indeed one of the central challenges for SMEs, and you mentioned rural areas, access to technologies. I think those are challenges, and indeed, when you launch initiatives that I mentioned, such as Digital Academy and so on, of course, there is also a challenge of inclusivity, even if it's digital and supposed to be more inclusive than other type of initiatives. But I've seen in Africa a lot of the governments, especially during COVID, it was an exceptional time to see the creativity of the governments in order to reach out to these populations and give them access to funding and support and so on. We've seen a few creative initiatives in order to address this more remote populations and so on. The first one, as you know, in Africa, mobile money is very important, was to go through mobile money, for example, for support to funding. And this is something that has been used not only during the crisis, but also as a means of support, get access to credit, get access to insurance. And this is very effective in reaching out to remote populations. second thing that I've seen that was very creative is setting up like mobile banks that will be touring in the remote regions. And for example, getting there during the days where the populations were gathered for the markets or something else. Of course, you don't have a stable agency of a bank in a remote location, but then some of countries set up these mobile bank agencies that go through small town to small town and that can address the needs of the populations. So there has been some creative ideas as these ones during COVID, but that have also been sustained after this.
Fantastic, thank you. Perhaps one question that I want to put out there, and I hope Ana Maria is still here, Ana Maria Chiaga, who was having some questions also and reflections around how through the pandemic you now have seen a lack of separation, if I may say, between the business and the household expenses, and even more than before. And, you know, Ana Maria, I don't know if you want to voice some of your concerns and reflections around that and what you have seen into this group. So Ana Maria Chiaga, if you're still here, we would give over to you.
Yes, Nina, I'm still here. Thank you very much. And thank you to the panelists. The presentation was really good and the report as well. Now I'm, for some of you already know that I work with a lot with the informal economy. So what we have discovered now that everybody is trying to at least talk about recovery is that many of them are failing to do so. Why? Because during COVID, they absolutely couldn't separate anymore their business and household expenses. So everything got mixed up again, even though we have spent years to teach businesses to kind of try and separate the two, right? So now that they're in recovery, they're asking again, what do they need to do? Can they really recover one side of their, the business side without the household side, or can they recover the household side without the business side? So I'm curious to hear if anybody else has encountered this and what is being done out there that we can also do here in Africa. Thank you, and over.
Very good, thank you. Anyone from the panel who has thoughts on this question? If not, perhaps, it's a very specific question, and perhaps Ana Maria, we could look if we find a bit more data around that. Or Corina, I see you unmuted, so.
Yes, I think in general, one thing we've noticed, and I'm not sure if it answers directly your question, is that a lot of the measures that were targeted at households ended up having a positive externality on SMEs that are part of the informal sector, because ultimately the lines between the two are just very, very blurred. And then a lot of and what happened is that simple measures that would just support the households were ultimately also allowing the household owned businesses to continue their operations. So I think this is where the intersection happens quite naturally.
Right. And I'm reading one of the comments, that one of the participants put into the chat around saying how the emphasis that Janate put on women entrepreneurship in the agriculture sector is highly accurate. And it does kind of raise a question around how policies and frameworks take into the account potentially low literacy levels of entrepreneurs. And perhaps, I don't know if Rodrigue and Gary or Janate, if you had any experience of how training programs and these academies, also as you have in Morocco, did take into account this additional constraints of literacy.
I have two things that come to my mind. The first one is the big roles that corporates can play in this field. Again, I may give an examples of a Moroccan corporate, OCP, who is involved in fertilizer and agriculture, and they actually put on the ground a very concrete support to farmers. So they have agronomists going to visit the farmers on the ground and providing advice on how to get more efficient productivity of their soils and so on. So I think the corporate role can be very important because they have the expertise in order to help this uneducated entrepreneur to increase their productivity in the different sectors where they are involved, and specifically in agriculture. So I think this is a type of initiative that is very impactful. I'm also thinking about in the aspect of regulations and so on. I think there is one big question around women in agriculture in Africa, which is access to land, because there is this rule about inheritance and so on that are a bit complex for women to get access to land. It's sometimes more difficult for them than for men and so on. So this is also typically another big topic that governments are addressing in a few places from the regulation and law enforcement aspects in order to make sure that it's more, that the access to land is more equal, especially for women entrepreneurs in agriculture. Those were my two thoughts on this.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I do think Séverine wanted to add a point, especially around the digital side. So Séverine, please.
Yes, thank you, Nina. And that's more a reflection, right, in terms of the literacy and the access to training, taking into account the low literacy level. And here, certainly the very big progress we saw in digitalization is at the same time kind of a response to low literacy, because it gives access to, of course, audio and to video resources. And for us in delivering training in the ILO, we've been using quite a lot of online tool, which is really good. But at the same time, of course, it can be a potential only if our entrepreneurs have access to these digital tools. And we saw also that this is not, of course, straightforward, and that in very often can be also an additional challenge. So I think here it brings also, I mean, all this discussion about digitalization, etc., which is also very interesting, and we could see also a lot with the COVID, how it's powerful, but how can we really do better in terms of providing access and putting in place the infrastructure so that all these resources can be also accessible for micro entrepreneurs. This is also a very important challenge and potential, I think.
Thank you, Séverine. I know we're very close to the end, so I will put a last question on the table that we had from the group, which is around if we have seen differences and if there is any data on the returns, almost the return of an investment on some of these measures, and if they're different in some regions, like more the Northern or the Sub-Saharan Africa, and if we see any pattern. And on that, I will perhaps send over this wonderful question to Gary for the last one. So Gary, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, I think, I'm not aware of a study that we've done that would answer that question. I would say that, but certainly something we should be doing. So I think it needs to be done. I would say, one observation in terms of small firms, across the continent, I think there's a lot that can be learned globally from companies operating across the African continent in terms of existing resilience strategies, because the amount of risks, on a daily basis and obstacles just to doing business is extraordinarily high. And there's really great imaginative and innovative ways that small firms have been able to kind of work around some really extraordinary things. So it often amazes me. I mean, just living here in South Africa, it often amazes me, and I've got friends and different colleagues that have small business. It amazes me how they stay in business considering some of the risks they face. We have fairly big issues with electricity outages, which is a continual basis. If you're it's a key part of running a business. If you've got electricity outages for six hours a day, a common thing up and down the continent for many countries. Public utilities, accessing water, things like these, security issues, and have been able to kind of manage those kind of challenges and just kind of absorb them. And as one business owner said to me, they're not risks. They're things that we just have to incorporate into running a business, absorb the cost, and kind of get on with it. So I think there's a lot of learning that can be done, and there's a lot of kind of good examples that can be done that can be used in other parts of the world, from smaller firms here in Africa. And I certainly think, not to dodge the question, I think it's important, because I think there has to be that study analysis done of national level or sector or provincial level interventions, and what impact do they have, and what's the value for return on this. I think that needs to be done. But again, I think it's something like this. Unfortunately, I can't answer it off the top of my head. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you, Gary. So with that, I would like to close. I think we had very interesting questions that just shows the breadth of the debate we could have, but also the complexity of it, and bringing it again to the introductory kind of comments from Dragan and myself around there is no one size fits all. And the situation in agriculture is different from the situation that we see in women entrepreneurs, which is very different from a regional kind of consideration. And that's why we really try to have this framework as a menu of interventions, as a menu of what could be done. This menu is a living animal. It can be expanded. There will be new measures that can be added, but it's really to tease the thinking of any government, of any other ecosystem players on what are all the things that can be done and when do they apply the best or not. So with that, Dragan, I will hand over to you for any kind of closing reflections.
Well,
thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I will not even attempt to summarize it. I mean, the discussion was very rich. What I can say is that resilience is not a topic that it's going to be the flavor of the month and then it will go away, right? I mean, look at the number of crises we are facing, in terms of climate change, conflicts. I mean, there's left, right, and center, right? So we have to live with this. Now, our challenge is we have a very, very challenging, very difficult client base. I mean, Gary talked about it. Small business, micro firms, they don't have time and they don't have money. And then on top of that, we have a huge elephant in the room, informality. 62% of global workforce engaged in informal economy, right? And then, as this is not enough, we have governments in many countries short on cash and struggling financially, right? So how do you actually then bring all that together into some kind of systemic and strategic approach towards helping a country to deal with resilience crisis and building resilience and to deal with the crisis, especially when you have a huge number of small businesses? I think we just started. The framework is mean to an end. It's not the end in itself. We know that it's not just good enough to train small businesses if there is no support from the top. We understand that industries have different challenges. So I think the whole approach towards addressing the resilience challenge in one country has to be done virtually at the level of the policy, right? And then at the industry level, understanding the differences of various industries, and especially looking at the small businesses, and in particular informal enterprises. And that means that we have to change the way also how we think and how we operate in order to reach millions of informal enterprises. You know, we're talking here about, you know, I've seen in the chat, you know, using the phones and SME chat, activity-based learning. You know, we actually have to try to do different things in order to address this challenge. And for that, we also need strategic partnerships. That's why we partnered with McKinsey, and we're going to partner with other organizations. We have our social partners at the national level. This is what we have to do. I mean, there is only one way, and this is moving forward now. So thank you, Nina, and thank you everybody for the great contributions today. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, and wishing everybody a very nice end of the day and afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.